On March 7, 1944, at 8:30 a.m., Vice Admiral Ozawa stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Taiho, observing the sunrise over Linga Road's anchorage off Sumatra. The ship beneath his feet symbolized 32 months of effort, 16,000 tons of steel, and the last remaining hope for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Taiho was Japan's only fleet carrier commissioned since the war began. 3 days earlier, Ozawa had received intelligence reports indicating that the Americans had launched 70 new fleet carriers in just that period. Furthermore, they had ceased counting smaller carriers. These figures seemed implausible to him, defying his understanding of industrial capacity and shipyard limitations. Japan had spent decades constructing what was once the world's finest carrier force. Yet despite supposedly starting from scratch, the Americans were now launching a new carrier every month in less time than it took Japan to build Taiho. Ozawa recognized that these numbers indicated the war was already lost for Japan. While combat would continue for another 16 months and thousands more lives would be lost, the outcome had been determined by the mathematical advantage, steel production, and welding skills of American shipyards 7,000 miles away. The question that haunted Ozawa's nights remained simpler. How did they manage it? Japan had entered the war with an unmatched carrier force. 6 fleet carriers and 2 light carriers made up Japan's carrier force, all of which were modern and well versed in combat scenarios. The United States Pacific Fleet boasted only 4 carriers. Numerically and tactically, the Japanese Navy held an advantage, having developed extensive carrier doctrine over a span of 2 decades since 1922. They possessed unparalleled expertise in carrier operations compared to other navies globally. Their pilots were highly trained, their aircraft had proven themselves in combat, and their tactics had been honed through years of warfare in China. In contrast, American carriers lacked 实战经验。美国飞行员缺乏经验，美国的作战理论仍处于理论阶段。理论上，日本应该在航母战中占据主导地位多年，但纸上谈兵毕竟有限。到1941年12月，日本意识到面临一个根本性的问题：美国的工业生产能力是其10倍之多，钢铁产量、造船能力、机床制造等方面全面优于日本，差距大的似乎无法弥补。伊藤武门 Isoroku Yamamoto 海军中将比日本高层任何人都更清楚这一点。他曾在美国担任海军武官，亲眼目睹了美国工厂、船厂和工业基础设施的规模。He informed the Japanese government that Japan could secure victories for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that period, American industrial capabilities would dominate anything Japan could manufacture. The authorities dismissed his warnings and held on to their beliefs that spirit alone could triumph over material strength. They thought tactical ingenuity could overpower numerical superiority, and they were convinced that Japan's warrior culture gave them an edge factories couldn't replicate. However, this proved to be misguided. The first carrier Japan lost was Shu, which sank on May 7th. 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea after enduring 13 bomb hits and 7 torpedo strikes from American aircraft carriers. Shu was a light carrier weighing in at 11,000 tons, originally converted from a submarine tender and equipped with 30 planes. Despite its significance, her loss did not prove to be catastrophic. 1 month later, Japan suffered the loss of 4 fleet carriers on a single day during the Battle of Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Sun was sunk by American dive bombers in just 6 minutes of combat. These 4 vessels represented 2 decades of Japanese naval advancements, 40,000 tons of irreplaceable combat strength, and approximately 250 aircraft. The naval staff in Tokyo received these reports and promptly started calculating replacement timelines. It took 4 years to build Akagi, 6 years for Kaga, and 3 years for Soryu. It took 4 years to build Hyu, which is considered an average construction period for such projects. Each fleet carrier required 4¼ years to construct, resulting in the loss of 4 ships that needed 17 years to replace entirely. Japan had 3 primary shipyards capable of constructing fleet carriers: Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Kyo Naval Arsenal, and Kawasaki Shipyard in Kobe. These yards were operating at full capacity, producing destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and merchant vessels to compensate for combat losses and support offensive operations. To rebuild the 4 lost carriers, all 3 shipyards would need to focus solely on carrier construction for approximately 6 years, which was not feasible as it would halt production of other essential naval vessels. Given the demands of the war effort, Japan could not spare this extensive period without compromising its overall fleet capacity. As a result, the naval staff opted for an alternative strategy. They decided to complete Taihaho, which had been initiated before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and convert merchant ships and seaplane tenders into light carriers. Additionally, they would design and build a new class of smaller, more cost-effective carriers that could be manufactured quicker. On paper, this plan seemed sensible. Taiho would maintain fleet carrier capabilities, conversions would offer temporary replacements, and the newly designed Unryu-class carriers would eventually rebuild Japan's numerical advantage. However, despite careful planning and resource allocation, the strategy ultimately proved unsuccessful. The keel for Taihaho was laid on July 10, 1941. The ship was launched on April 7, 1943 and commissioned on March 7, 1944, marking a total of 32 months from the laying of the keel to its commissioning. This time frame was relatively quick for a Japanese fleet carrier. In contrast, Shukaku and Zukaku, whose construction began in late 1937, took 44 and 45 months respectively. Japan had notably accelerated its carrier production schedule. The achievement of completing Taihaho in just 32 months was significant. On December 31, 1942, the U.S. Essex was commissioned. Its keel had been laid on April 28, 1941, representing a construction period of only 20 months. Despite being larger than Taihaho, with a standard displacement of 2,700 tons compared to 2,300 tons for Taihaho, and carrying 90 aircraft as opposed to Taihaho's 75, the Americans managed to build this carrier in 43% less time. However, the most startling aspect was that Essex was merely the beginning of a series of rapid carrier launches. In January 1943, Lexington was commissioned, followed by Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Intrepid, Hornet, and Franklin over subsequent months. By December 1943, 11 Essex-class carriers had been put into service within just 1 year, a stark contrast to Japan's single Taihaho commission in the same period. Early 1944, naval officials in Tokyo pored over intelligence reports with disbelief, repeatedly cross-checking data. They initially suspected American propaganda exaggeration, but were eventually compelled to accept the veracity of reconnaissance findings. Photographic and radio intelligence confirmed that American carriers were being launched at a rate faster than Japan could train pilots to operate them. But how? The solution lay with Henry Kaiser, a man who had no experience in shipbuilding before 1941. Instead of constructing ships, he was known for his expertise in building massive concrete structures such as dams, roads, and bridges like the Hoover Dam, Bonneville Dam, and Grand 1941. The United States Maritime Commission faced a critical need for cargo ships, hundreds and thousands of them, to transport essential supplies across both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Traditional shipyards estimated that it would take 6 months to build just one cargo ship due to their methodical process, laying down the keel, constructing from the bottom up, riveting steel plates together, installing engines, launching the hull, and then finishing off the interior over several more months. However, Kaiser saw an entirely different challenge. The Maritime Commission required 2,000 ships, a task that would consume a millennium of shipyard capacity at the traditional pace. Instead of focusing on individual vessels, Kaiser viewed them as large-scale structures. Kaiser suggested constructing ships using steel components that could be prefabricated off-site and then assembled at the shipyard. Instead of building vessels sequentially from the ground up, he advocated for assembling them from pre-welded sections. Traditional shipbuilders dismissed this approach as impractical, citing riveting as a reliable method compared to the perceived risks associated with welding, such as seam failures or cracks that could compromise structural integrity. Undeterred by skepticism, Kaiser established 4 shipyards in Richmond, California, situated along San Francisco Bay. He recruited workers from all over the country, many of whom lacked maritime experience and had never seen a ship before. The workforce included women and African Americans, groups typically excluded from such roles. Experience mattered little to Kaiser. He prioritized efficient organization. Ship construction was divided into modular components that could be manufactured in separate pre-fabrication workshops. Each module comprising deck sections, bulkheads, engine rooms, superstructures, and other parts was designed so that workers needed only to focus on welding specific pieces. These modules were constructed either sideways or upside down for optimal welding conditions and then hoisted into place using large cranes before being joined together. The initial Liberty ship Kaiser built took 196 days to complete. It took 45 days for the 10th ship to be completed. By 1943, Kaiser Shipyards had managed to build Liberty ships with an average time of 42 days. The record stood at 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Notably, the SS Robert E. Perry was constructed in November 1942 as a publicity event showcasing the potential of their methods. Traditionally, building a ship took 6 months, but Kaiser's approach could accomplish it in just 4 days. This technique proved effective for cargo ships, prompting questions about its applicability to aircraft carriers. Kaiser suggested adapting his techniques for escort carrier production. These were smaller carriers constructed on merchant hulls designed primarily for convoy protection and ground support rather than fleet operations. The Navy remained doubtful due to the complexity of carriers, which required specialized equipment and highly skilled workers with years of experience. Despite skepticism, Kaiser responded, "Give him a chance." His shipyard in Vancouver, Washington laid down the keel for the escort carrier Casablanca on November 3, 1942. The vessel was launched on April 5, 1943 and commissioned on July 8, 1943. This meant an impressive 8 months from laying the keel to commissioning. With a goal set by the Navy for 50 escort carriers, Kaiser achieved this milestone in just 14 months, producing 1 carrier every 8 days. The Japanese naval staff initially dismissed these reports as inaccuracies. Deploying a single aircraft carrier every 8 days was an unrealistic goal that contravened all established principles of naval engineering. However, this claim was repeatedly corroborated by actual combat engagements and reports. By late 1943, American carrier task forces were appearing in the Pacific Ocean with unprecedented numbers, sometimes comprising up to 12, 15, or even 18 carriers in a single formation. This was staggering, considering that Japan's total carrier fleet consisted of just 6 vessels. The Americans were forming task groups that dwarfed the entirety of Japan's carrier strength. So, where did these numerous American carriers come from? While Kaiser Shipyards had been constructing escort carriers, the larger Air Essex-class fleet carriers were also being deployed in significant numbers. The key to this accelerated production lay in the application of prefabrication techniques similar to those used for building cargo ships. Newport News Shipbuilding, which had a long history of carrier construction dating back to the 1930s, recognized that traditional methods took years and sought improvements by adopting welding over riveting where feasible. This not only sped up production but also required less skilled labor and resulted in lighter structures. Moreover, they standardized designs across the Essex-class carriers, using identical plans, components, and equipment for each ship. Workers became adept at constructing individual modules that could be replicated in mass. Through these innovations, construction sequences were streamlined, enabling more efficient assembly processes. Rather than waiting for one section to finish before beginning another, various sections were constructed concurrently in different sites and later assembled together. USS Franklin, which was built at Newport News, had its keel laid on December 7, 1942. It was launched on October 14, 1943 and commissioned into service on January 31, 1944. This process took a total of 13 months from start to finish. However, this timeline did not set the record. Several Essex-class carriers were completed within 14 to 16 months. On average, it took about 18 months for an Essex-class carrier to be built. In contrast, Japan's Taihaho took 32 months from keel laying to commissioning. American shipyards were constructing fleet carriers at a rate twice as fast compared to their Japanese counterparts, and they were producing more than double the number of ships. By March 1944, when Taihaho was commissioned, the United States had 17 Essex-class carriers either in service or under construction. This amounted to a ratio of roughly 17-1. The disparity widened even further if one considered light and escort carriers. By mid-1944, America operated more than 100 carriers overall, while Japan had only 9. Recognizing the need for adaptation, Japan initiated orders for 14 unreliable class carriers. These were intended to be smaller and simpler designs, optimized for mass production. Based on the pre-war Hiyu design, but updated with modern technology using tried and true components, the unreliable class displaced 1,750 tons, could carry up to 60 aircraft, and achieve a speed of 34 knots. However, only 3 ships were completed in this series. Unryu Amaji Katsuragi re-entered service on August 6, 1944, followed by Amaji on August 10, 1944 and Katsuragi on October 15, 1944. This marked a brief period of rapid carrier construction for Japan, spanning just over 2 months. However, the United States managed to commission 9 Essex-class carriers during the same time frame, demonstrating an even more accelerated pace of production. Japan appeared to be stepping up its efforts in carrier manufacturing. Yet, the Americans were outpacing them at every turn. Moreover, resource scarcity began to take a toll on Japan's ability to maintain this momentum. Constructing a single carrier required significant amounts of steel. An Essex-class vessel alone contained roughly 27,000 tons of it. In stark contrast, the U.S. produced an astonishing 60 million tons of steel in 1943 and increased that figure to 80 million tons by 1944. Meanwhile, Japan's production declined from 8 million tons in 1943 to just 6 million in 1944. This massive disparity meant the U.S. was manufacturing 10 times more steel than Japan's total industrial output. This overwhelming difference in steel availability had far-reaching consequences for naval construction. American shipyards were flush with materials, allowing them to construct entire hulls and armor without hesitation, even if errors required scrapping parts or starting anew. Conversely, Japanese yards operated under strict material rationing, often forced to make do with insufficient supplies. Each plate was invaluable, and any mistakes needed to be corrected rather than replaced. This led to delays as workers spent more time fixing errors than progressing with construction. American shipyards boasted modern machine tools such as lathes, drill presses, milling machines, and other precision equipment, all powered and capable of high-speed production. In contrast, Japanese facilities were limited in their machinery, which was often outdated, worn out, or breaking down due to a lack of replacement parts. This caused further delays as workers waited for repairs. In terms of welding equipment, American shipyards were well equipped with thousands of stations using oxygen-acetylene torches and electric arc welders that were standardized and maintained efficiently. Japanese yards, however, faced shortages in welding supplies, forcing many to rely on riveting due to insufficient welding capacity. The disparity also affected the workforce. By 1943, American shipyards had hired 2 million workers who, although new to the industry, were trained rapidly through standardized methods and repetitive tasks. Kaiser's Richmond shipyard alone employed 90,000 workers at its peak, a number surpassing the total workforce of Japan's 3 major naval yards combined. The Richmond workforce was notably diverse. Around 40% were women from various backgrounds, including farm wives from rural areas and teachers from small towns, many of whom had never held industrial jobs before. Within just 2 weeks, they mastered welding techniques. In a mere 3 days, they became proficient at operating cranes. After 1 week, reading blueprints had become second nature. Conventional shipbuilders doubted that these newcomers could produce high-quality vessels due to the lack of extensive experience necessary for precise metalwork. However, Kaiser's innovative pre-fabrication method did not demand years of hands-on training. Instead, it sought individuals capable of performing a single task repeatedly and with accuracy. In the Richmond yards, welders didn't need to grasp the complexities of ship design. All they needed was proficiency in welding particular types of seams on specific joints. The blueprints indicated where jigs and fixtures were positioned, guiding their work as they moved from one component to another, welding identical joints numerous times per shift. Through repetition, expertise emerged quickly. Within a month, workers accelerated their pace, and by 2 months precision was achieved. After 3 months, these workers outperformed traditional shipwrights who had spent years honing their skills. The Japanese found it challenging to emulate this approach. Their shipyards employed around 300,000 people, many of whom were skilled artisans, but thinly spread across numerous projects. Training new employees was sluggish because experienced hands were too occupied teaching newcomers. More importantly, Japan's industrial ethos prioritized craftsmanship over standardization, making it difficult for them to adopt a system that emphasized uniformity and efficiency. A meticulous Japanese shipfitter took great care to tailor each component individually, making small tweaks for flawless assembly. This method yielded aesthetically pleasing vessels but was time-consuming. In contrast, American workers did not customize any parts. Instead, they were fabricated according to strict specifications in pre-fabrication plants. Parts either matched perfectly or were discarded and replaced with new ones. This approach led to functional ships being produced rapidly. The contrasting methodologies mirrored the disparity in industrial capabilities. Japan faced constraints in steel supplies, machinery, and labor, necessitating that every piece be utilized efficiently. Waste was not an option. By custom fitting, they ensured no material went unused. Conversely, America had ample resources, steel machine tools, and workers, which allowed them to discard parts that did not fit and focus on speed rather than perfection. Both strategies were valid, but during wartime conditions, expediency prevailed. With a surplus of labor, Americans could specialize their workforce. One group would construct bulkheads, another would assemble deck sections, while yet another team would handle the installation of propulsion systems. Specialization boosted efficiency. Japanese shipyards required workers capable of performing all tasks. Ship fitters had responsibilities that included fitting hulls, installing machinery, and managing electrical systems. Generalists were adaptable but slower in their work processes. Newport News Shipbuilding, the yard responsible for constructing most Essex-class carriers, established specialized assembly zones for various carrier components. One building measuring 500 feet in length was exclusively used for fabricating flight deck sections. Giant overhead cranes transported steel plates from storage racks to cutting stations, where workers employed acetylene torches to cut the plates according to specifications. The cut pieces then moved to edge preparation stations, where workers beveled edges for welding. Following that, they were positioned in assembly jigs and tack welded together. Finally, at welding stations, teams of welders completed permanent welds, each responsible for specific sections. A complete flight deck section measuring 120 feet by 90 feet took 8 days from raw steel to finished component. Using traditional methods with a single crew worker on the shipway would have taken 6 weeks. Another building was dedicated to fabricating elevator assemblies. Carrier elevators were intricate hydraulic mechanisms capable of lifting 30-ton aircraft from the hangar deck to the flight deck in 30 seconds. Traditional shipyards installed elevators piece by piece within the carrier hull, a challenging task due to cramped spaces and the need for precise alignment and extensive testing. At Newport News, entire elevator assemblies were constructed in dedicated workshops. These assemblies underwent testing, adjustment, and verification before being moved to the ship. During installation, cranes hosted complete elevator units into place, reducing connection time from weeks to days. The propulsion systems underwent similar modifications. Each carrier class required 4 sets of turbines, 8 boilers, reduction gears, propeller shafts, and thousands of feet of steam piping. Traditionally, installing this equipment would take several months. Newport News developed propulsion module assemblies that included a complete turbine set, 2 boilers, and all related piping, pre-assembled and tested in advance. These modules were constructed in a dedicated facility equipped with instrumentation and controls. They underwent testing using temporary steam connections to ensure proper functioning. Once the carrier hull was ready, cranes hoisted each entire propulsion module into place within the machinery space. Workers then connected steam lines, electrical cables, and control systems. The installation process took just 3 weeks instead of the usual 3 months. This modular approach applied to all aspects of construction. Radar systems were pre-assembled and tested at the factory. Complete radar masts with antennas, transmitters, receivers, and power supplies were manufactured in electronic shops and installed as units. Crew accommodations were also prefabricated. Berthing compartments equipped with bunks, lockers, lighting, and ventilation were assembled in specialized workshops and then lifted into position within the hull. Even smaller components adhered to standard specifications. Every hatch was identical, along with every door ladder and ventilation duct, all conforming to standardized dimensions. Workers did not need to measure, cut, or fit each piece individually. They simply retrieved pre-made components from storage and bolted or welded them into place before moving on to the next task. As a result, carriers progressed from keel laying to launch in 6 to 8 months, followed by another 6 to 8 months for outfitting and trials prior to commissioning. The total duration from commencement to operational readiness for an aircraft carrier was between 14 and 16 months. Japan struggled to achieve this timeline due to the absence of 3 crucial factors. Firstly, they lacked the industrial base necessary for large-scale production. Prefabrication demanded factories capable of manufacturing thousands of identical components with precise tolerances. American industry had established such infrastructure through decades of experience in automobile appliance and consumer goods manufacturing. These facilities were designed around assembly lines, standardized parts, and interchangeable components. In contrast, Japanese industry was primarily geared towards small-scale custom work. Precision parts typically came from specialized machine shops rather than assembly lines. Attempting to replicate American prefabrication methods would have necessitated the construction of entirely new factories, training new workforces, and developing new supply chains, a task Japan lacked both the time and expertise to undertake. Secondly, Japan faced a shortage of raw materials. Prefabrication is inherently wasteful. More steel than required is cut, parts that do not fit are discarded, and components are overstocked to prevent shortages. When Kaiser's Richmond shipyards constructed a Liberty ship, they ordered 15% more steel than needed. This excess accounted for waste, errors, rejected parts, and inventory buffers. Such an approach was feasible when raw materials were abundant but became impractical when resources were scarce. Japan could not tolerate a 15% waste rate. Each ton of steel plate was invaluable, so minimizing waste was critical. This requirement necessitated meticulous custom fitting, leading to slower production and extended construction periods. Additionally, Japan faced significant logistical challenges due to its inadequate transportation infrastructure. American prefabrication methods were highly effective because components could be manufactured throughout the country and swiftly transported by rail to shipyards. For instance, a bulkhead section fabricated in Pennsylvania could reach Newport News via flatbed railcar within 24 hours and be integrated into a carrier hull just 2 days later. In contrast, Japan's rail network was limited, with most heavy components moving through coastal shipping routes that were frequently targeted by American submarines. A turbine constructed in Kobe might take up to 2 weeks to arrive at Yokosuka by ship, and if it encountered an attack en route, the entire process would need to be repeated from scratch. These supply chain vulnerabilities severely hampered Japanese naval construction efforts more than any other single factor. The issue extended into logistics. American shipyards received a steady flow of materials such as steel, aluminum, copper, rubber, and electronics via rail and truck deliveries from factories across the continent. If one supplier experienced difficulties, there were numerous alternatives available to ensure continuity. In contrast, Japanese shipyards relied almost exclusively on shipping, which was fraught with risks due to constant submarine attacks. Steel was imported from mills located in Korea and Manchuria, while copper originated from mines in the Philippines. Rubber came from the Dutch East Indies. Merchant ships transporting these materials were increasingly being sunk by American submarines at a growing rate. By 1944, Japan's merchant fleet losses outpaced its shipyards' capacity to build replacements. Crucial supplies were failing to arrive due to this issue. Shipyard operations were delayed because they awaited steel plates, turbine blades, and electrical cables. Taiho was designed with 8 boilers and 4 turbines, generating a total of 160,000 shaft horsepower. 2 Henry-class carriers, Katsuragi and Aso, had been constructed using destroyer engines since turbine manufacturers could not produce the necessary fleet carrier power plants quickly enough. Consequently, these carriers were limited to speeds of 25 knots rather than the intended 34 knots. The reduced speed compromised their tactical flexibility, making it harder for them to evade attacks or close with enemy forces. In contrast, American naval operations experienced no such limitations. Every Essex-class carrier featured uniform propulsion systems, providing 150,000 shaft horsepower and capable of reaching speeds up to 33 knots without exception. The Japanese Navy also encountered severe challenges in pilot training. While constructing carriers was one hurdle, equipping them with skilled pilots was equally crucial. Prior to the war, Japan boasted some of the world's best naval aviators who underwent rigorous 2-year training programs before making their first carrier landings. Training included navigation, gunnery practice, formation flying, night operations, and approaches to carriers. However, by 1943, this extended period of instruction was no longer feasible due to shortages in time and resources. The efforts spanned less than a year. American submarines were decimating Japan's merchant fleet, limiting fuel supplies for pilot training flights. As a result, the duration of flight training was drastically reduced from 24 months to just 12 months, and then further cut down to 8 months. By this point, pilots were being deployed with only around 100 hours of flying experience instead of the usual 500 hours. While these trainees could handle basic maneuvers and combat engagements, their lack of extensive training left them ill-prepared for aerial battles against seasoned American aviators. Saburo Sakai, renowned among Japan's elite aces with 64 confirmed kills, was reassigned from combat duty in early 1943 to serve as an instructor. Upon joining the training program, he was dismayed by its inefficiencies and shortcomings. The curriculum struggled under the strain of too many students per instructor, causing lessons to be hurried through without sufficient attention paid to foundational skills that should have been mastered. According to Sakai's later reflections, there was a sense of urgency to expedite the graduates' readiness, often at the expense of thorough instruction on nuanced aspects of flying and combat. Consequently, these hastily trained pilots were assigned to carrier squadrons, where they faced fierce opposition from experienced American forces during key naval engagements such as the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. In this battle, Japan committed around 450 carrier-based aircraft against U.S. task forces. However, American fighter planes managed to shoot down approximately 3/4 of these Japanese planes. The Americans referred to it as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, highlighting the glaring deficiencies within the Japanese naval aviation training and operational strategies. In 1944, Japan deployed 9 aircraft carriers to the conflict 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokoku, Zukoku, and 6 light carriers including Chaitos, Chiyoda, Junyo, Hyo, Raijo. These carriers carried a total of 450 aircraft, which was significantly fewer than their full capacity. Japan faced an acute shortage of aircraft to fully outfit its carrier fleet. Furthermore, the pilots assigned to these planes were poorly trained. Prior to World War II, Japanese carrier pilots underwent 2 years of rigorous training before embarking on combat missions. However, by June 1944, inexperienced pilots were being sent out after only 6 months of training. They could manage basic takeoffs and landings along with operating their aircraft systems, but lacked the essential combat experience needed to compete against seasoned American pilots flying more advanced aircraft. Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58, which boasted a formidable fleet of 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers and 8 light carriers. These U.S. carriers embarked 956 aircraft in total, nearly double the number carried by their Japanese counterparts, and these American planes had superiority over their adversaries. The F-6F Hellcat fighter, for instance, could reach a maximum speed of 380 mph compared to the A6M0's 340 mph. Additionally, the Hellcat was capable of diving at up to 450 mph without sustaining structural damage, whereas the Zero had a maximum dive speed of only 360 mph. Moreover, the Hellcat featured pilot armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and an armored engine cowling, allowing it to sustain significant battle damage while remaining operational. The Zero lacked any form of armor, and a single burst from a machine gun aimed at the fuel tank could ignite it immediately. The absence of protective measures for pilots resulted in severe casualties. In contrast, the Hellcat was equipped with 6 60-50 caliber machine guns capable of firing a combined of 1 to 800 rounds per minute. Although the Zero featured 2 20 mm cannons and 2 7.7 mm machine guns, its total sustained firepower was inferior to that of the Hellcat. Crucially, American pilots in June 1944 were seasoned veterans with extensive combat experience. The typical American fighter pilot serving in Task Force 58 had logged over 200 hours of combat flight time, with many accumulating up to 300 hours or more. These pilots had engaged in numerous battles at Tarawa Truk, Hollandia, and other smaller skirmishes, gaining a deep understanding of their aircraft's capabilities and how to leverage the Hellcat's strengths against enemy fighters. They were also well versed in tactics for defeating Zeros effectively. By comparison, Japanese pilots typically had only 20 hours or less of combat experience, some had none at all. Facing their first carrier operation against what was arguably the largest and most experienced naval air force ever assembled, the outcome was foreseeable. On June 19th, Japan launched its initial strike wave of 69 aircraft at 7:30 a.m., which American radar detected from a distance of 150 miles. Fighter Command dispatched 40 Hellcats to intercept the incoming threat. The Hellcats engaged a Japanese formation 40 miles away from the carriers. Within the first 10 minutes of combat, they shot down 42 enemy planes. The remaining Japanese aircraft pressed on towards the carriers and faced additional American fighter squadrons, along with intense anti-aircraft fire from escorting destroyers and cruisers. Only 8 aircraft managed to breach these defenses and approach the carriers, but none inflicted any damage. 4 of those aircraft were able to return to their carriers. Japan's initial strike force suffered a staggering 94% loss rate. The second wave, which took off at 8:56 a.m., encountered similarly formidable opposition. A total of unmanned 9 planes met this layered defense system, and American fighters destroyed 97 of them before they could reach their targets. The third wave, consisting of 107 aircraft, achieved only 1 hit on the battleship South Dakota, resulting in minor damage. Meanwhile, the fourth strike became disoriented. Some aircraft located American carriers but were driven off, while others failed to find the enemy and had to return with unspent ordnance. Out of the total 450 aircraft launched by Japan, 300 were shot down and another 50 crashed attempting to land on their carriers in the dark following the battle. In summary, Japan lost 350 planes and their pilots within a single day of combat, whereas America only suffered losses of 29 aircraft. This exchange ratio of 12:1 favored the United States due to its superior aircraft pilots, doctrine, and radar guidance capabilities, as well as the repercussions of Japan's inadequate carrier construction program. Had Japan been capable of constructing aircraft carriers at a pace comparable to that of the United States, they might have deployed up to 30 carriers instead of just 9 into the Philippine Sea. Despite their pilots and aircraft being inferior to those of the US, an armada of 30 carriers would have put nearly 200 planes in the air. potentially overwhelming American defenses with sheer numbers alone. However, Japan only fielded 9 carriers initially. By the conclusion of the battle, 3 of these carriers were lost. Taiho, Shu, Kakyu, and Hio were among those that perished. Taiho had been commissioned just months earlier but was torpedoed by an American submarine named Kavala on June 19th. Although the damage from a single torpedo strike should have been manageable given Japan's established damage control protocols, a rookie damage control officer made a grave mistake. He instructed crew members to activate the ventilation system in order to clear gasoline fumes from the hangar deck. Instead of venting these fumes overboard, this action spread them throughout the ship. 6 hours later, a spark ignited the volatile mixture, resulting in an explosion that tore apart the carrier and sent her to the bottom within minutes, claiming the lives of 272 men. Taiho had spent roughly 3 months in construction before seeing just 3 more in service. Shukaku, one of Japan's most battle-hardened carriers with a history spanning from Pearl Harbor through Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, met her end after being struck by 4 torpedoes from Kavala. The carrier sank 7 hours later. Meanwhile, Hio was targeted both by aerial bombs and torpedoes, leading to fires that eventually caused the loss of power and sinking. In a single day, Japan suffered the loss of 3 carriers while not managing to sink any American ships in return. By late 1944, Japan's carrier fleet had essentially been eradicated. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October, the Japanese deployed their remaining carriers as a diversionary force. 4 carriers with virtually no aircraft on board sailed north to lure American carriers away from the main engagement area. The ruse succeeded. American carrier planes attacked these decoy ships and sank all 4, but Japan gained nothing strategically from this sacrifice. Despite this loss, American escort carriers in subsequent engagements successfully repelled the Japanese surface fleet. The diversionary tactic resulted in the destruction of Japan's final carriers without yielding any strategic advantage. Zukaku, one of the 6 carriers that participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, met its end on October 25, 1944. Having survived 3 years of intense combat operations, it was ultimately sunk due to a severe shortage of aircraft and pilots available for defense. By November 1944, Japan had no operational fleet carriers left, while the United States possessed 28. The American industrial prowess extended far beyond mere numbers. It encompassed an entire system that allowed rapid repair and maintenance of damaged ships. For instance, when USS Franklin was by 2 bombs on March 19, 1945, off the coast of Japan, the vessel suffered significant damage. The explosions in the hangar led to a series of secondary blasts from fueled and armed aircraft, resulting in extensive fires that lasted for hours. 87 crew members lost their lives, despite being heavily damaged, listing, and ablaze with magazines at risk of detonation. Any other navy would have abandoned the ship. However, thanks to standardized parts and extensive repair facilities, USS Franklin was able to undergo repairs within weeks or months in a naval yard using prefabricated replacement sections. Franklin was severely damaged, but American damage control teams managed to extinguish fires, stabilize the ship's list, and restart the engines. She then sailed under her own power at 14 knots to Pearl Harbor. Following repairs there, Franklin continued on to the Brooklyn Navy Yard for further maintenance. The vessel arrived in Brooklyn on April 28, 1945. Despite this extensive repair work, the war concluded before she could return to active duty. Such effective damage control was beyond Japan's capabilities. Japanese carriers that suffered significant hits typically sank or were deliberately sunk due to a lack of adequate repair infrastructure, spare parts, and trained personnel needed for such repairs. The disparity in industrial capacity between the 2 nations was evident across various aspects of carrier operations. American carriers were equipped with radar systems like the Type SK air search radar, which could detect incoming aircraft at 90 miles. And the Type SM height finding radar to determine altitude accurately. Fighter directors used radar data to guide interceptors towards approaching enemy formations well before they reached the fleet. In contrast, Japanese carriers had limited radar capabilities. Early models could only detect aircraft at about 30 miles under optimal conditions, with night operations and adverse weather significantly reducing their effectiveness. Japanese fighter directors depended heavily on visual sightings and radio reports from picket ships for guidance. Additionally, American carriers were armed with proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. The VT fuse utilized a small radar to trigger the shell's detonation when an aircraft was nearby, offering a significant advantage over conventional ammunition used by the Japanese. Proximity fuses boosted anti-aircraft efficiency by 5 to 10 times over contact or time fuses. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carriers employed only these latter types of fuses, which required shells to either hit their target directly or detonate at a specific altitude, making them far less effective than proximity fuses. American naval aviation had superior aircraft. For instance, the CIF Hellcat outperformed the A6M0 in nearly all aspects: speed, climb rate, diving speed, armor protection, and armament. While the Zero was lighter and more agile, it suffered from slower speeds, greater fragility, and insufficient firepower to quickly destroy well-armored American planes. American carriers also benefited from better tactical doctrines. Fighter sweeps were used to clear enemy airspace prior to strikes. Combat air patrols safeguarded the fleet against incoming attacks, and radar-directed intercepts allowed fighters to engage approaching enemies before they could reach their targets. The Japanese carrier strategy relied on a full-scale assault, launching all available aircraft to hit the adversary with overwhelming force in hopes of sinking American carriers before they retaliated. This approach proved successful at Pearl Harbor due to complete surprise, but failed at Midway and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where early warnings from radar and coordinated fighter escorts decimated incoming Japanese strike forces. By 1945, the Japanese Navy's carrier fleet had essentially been eliminated as an effective combat force. Although Japan retained battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, these ships lacked carrier-based air support and could not venture into areas within reach of American naval aircraft. The last few Japanese carriers were restricted to training exercises or transport duties due to a shortage of both pilots and aircraft. In contrast, the United States Navy possessed more carrier-based air power than all other navies combined. Task Force 38, operating off Japan in July 1945, comprised 17 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers embarking over 1,500 aircraft. This formidable force could be assembled, launched, and recovered within 2 hours. With such overwhelming air power, Japan had no means to counter it. American carrier strikes swept across Japanese territory without restraint, targeting airfields, factories, ports, naval bases, and other critical infrastructure. The Japanese air defenses were easily overwhelmed, with their fighters outnumbered by as much as 10 to 1 or even 20 to 1. The war concluded on August 15, 1945. During the conflict, Japan commissioned 6 carriers, 3 UNRU-class fleet carriers, and 3 converted light carriers. In comparison, America launched 20 new carriers, 4 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and over 100 escort carriers. The final carrier ratio stood at approximately 20 to 1 in favor of the United States. This statistic encapsulated how industrial capacity influenced the outcome of the Pacific War. Japan began its naval campaign with the world's finest carrier force, developed over 2 decades by Asia's most skilled shipbuilders and naval architects. Conversely, America started the war with an unproven carrier fleet constructed by inexperienced shipyards that had to learn carrier construction as they went. However, America possessed unmatched industrial capacity, abundant raw materials, technological advancements, adaptability, and the capability to scale production at unprecedented levels. These factors proved decisive in the carrier construction race, which extended well beyond World War II's confines. Industrial capability surpasses tactical brilliance in significance. In 1941, the Japanese Navy possessed superior carrier doctrine. Their pilots were more skilled, their aircraft better designed, and they had accumulated extensive combat experience. As a result, They emerged victorious from every engagement during the first 6 months of the war. However, tactical superiority is fleeting. Pilots perish in battle, aircraft become outdated, and doctrines evolve over time. In contrast, industrial advantages accumulate and intensify. With each new carrier built by America, the process became more efficient, allowing for quicker construction of subsequent carriers. Each trained worker streamlined the training of their successors, and every standardized component optimized supply chain logistics. By mid-1943, American carrier production had reached a self-sustaining momentum. Shipyards were completing vessels faster than they could recruit and train crews to man them. In stark contrast, Japan struggled to maintain this industrial pace. Every carrier constructed drained critical resources from the next one's development. Each trained worker diverted time away from immediate production needs, and every standardized component necessitated retooling factories already operating at full capacity. The disparity grew exponentially over time. In early 1942, Japan boasted 8 operational carriers. By mid-1943, Japan had 6 operational aircraft carriers, while the United States possessed 3. By mid-1944, Japan's fleet included 7 operational carriers, whereas the US count had risen to 14. By early 1945, Japan found itself with no operational carriers left, while America's carrier numbers had surged to 32. The trend continued as American carrier strength reached a staggering 39 by war's end. This growth was not merely exponential, but geometric in nature, showcasing the dramatic disparity between the two nations' naval capabilities. During the course of World War II, Japan managed to construct only 6 fleet carriers and 3 light carriers, along with 0 escort carriers. In contrast, the United States embarked on a massive carrier building program that resulted in 24 Essex-class carriers and 9 Independence-class light carriers. Additionally, America constructed an impressive total of 77 Casablanca-class escort carriers alongside numerous other types. In summary, Japan's carrier construction efforts amounted to just 9 vessels over 3.5 years, whereas the United States dramatically outpaced this with the production of 110 carriers within the same period. The ratio was approximately 12:1, with each American carrier outnumbering its Japanese counterpart by a factor of 12. However, this numerical comparison understates the real disparity in capabilities. American carriers outmatched their adversaries in virtually every aspect. They were bigger, could accommodate more aircraft, boasted superior radar systems, had better anti-aircraft defenses, and were generally more advanced overall. For example, an Essex-class carrier was capable of operating up to 90 aircraft compared to a Shikoku-class carrier's capacity for about 65. An Essex-class vessel also achieved speeds of around 33 knots, whereas some Japanese carriers fitted with emergency destroyer engines struggled to reach even 25 knots. Furthermore, the radar systems on American carriers provided comprehensive coverage, while those aboard Japanese ships were limited and frequently malfunctioned during crucial moments. Consequently, this initial numerical edge translated into a combat capability ratio closer to 20:1 in actual engagements. Essentially, 20 American carriers worth of fighting power compared to just 1 Japanese carrier. This significant superiority transformed naval battles in the Pacific into lopsided encounters following mid-1944. Japanese surface fleets found it impossible to operate within striking distance of American carriers without facing annihilation. Similarly, Japanese bases and supply lines could not function effectively under threat from US carrier strikes, leading them to gradually retreat behind shrinking defensive perimeters. By July 1945, American carrier task forces were operating with impunity off the coast of Japan. They launched massive aerial assaults involving thousands of aircraft against enemy cities, overwhelming Japanese air defenses and bringing the war closer to a decisive conclusion through relentless bombardment from the sea. Japanese fighters faced a staggering numerical disadvantage of 50:1. The war's conclusion was not due to atomic bombs, which merely offered an excuse for the surrender of Japanese leaders. Rather, Japan had exhausted its military capabilities and could no longer mount resistance. Carrier aviation dismantled these resources, and large-scale carrier production enabled the fleet that secured victory. Henry Kaiser, a dam builder with no prior shipbuilding experience, transformed naval construction by implementing mass production methods. Newport News Shipyards, historically specialized in carriers, learned from Kaiser's innovations and halved their construction times. Richmond shipyard workers, many of whom were women who had never handled tools before 1942, constructed aircraft carriers within months instead of years. Collectively, they assembled a fleet that overwhelmed Japan through sheer industrial might. The Japanese realized too late that they had lost the war from the moment it began. Admiral Yamamoto had forewarned them about this inevitability. He predicted that Japan could win battles for 6 months to a year at most before American industrial prowess would overwhelm them. His prediction proved accurate, but he underestimated the rapid mobilization of American industry. Yamamoto believed it would take America 2 years to replace carriers lost during the Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea engagements. In reality, this took only 9 months. He also thought that American carrier production would peak at 8 to 10 ships annually. However, in 1943 alone, America produced 18 carriers. Moreover, he anticipated it would take many years for American pilots to match Japanese aviators' skills. By early 1943, less than 18 months after Pearl Harbor, American pilots were already outperforming their Japanese counterparts. Each assumption the Japanese made regarding American industrial capabilities proved incorrect. They consistently underestimated America's capacity to mobilize resources, train personnel, and manufacture weapons on an unprecedented scale that Japan found unimaginable. While the title may not be entirely accurate, it encapsulates the core truth of this narrative. Throughout 3 years of warfare, Japan managed to construct 6 aircraft carriers. The precise count can vary based on how conversions and reclassifications are accounted for, but 6 is generally acknowledged as the tally for purpose, built fleet carriers completed during the war. In contrast, America produced 17 Essex-class fleet carriers throughout World War II. To be exact, this number includes 8 additional ships that were still under construction when hostilities ceased and later either finished or cancelled, bringing the total to 17 commissioned vessels. If we include the Independence-class light carriers, the tally rises to 26. Incorporating the Casablanca-class escort carriers pushes the total to 103, while adding all other escort carrier classes brings it well over 130 carrier ships commissioned during the war. The statement that counting ceased is figurative rather than literal. The Navy meticulously tracked each vessel, but as numbers grew庞大的，单个航母的战略意义逐渐减弱。而到了1944年末，失去一艘航母在战术上确实令人遗憾，但在战略层面上却无关紧要，因为下个月就会有新的航母到来。相比之下，日本失去一艘航母便是一场全国性的危机，人们会举行祈祷和追悼仪式，海军指海军回官也会因为能保护这些无法替代的资产而受到指责。这种对航母损失的不同反应揭示了两国在工业能力上的巨大差距。对于日本而言，每一艘航母都是宝贵的资源，一旦丢失就需要数月或数年才能重建。对于美国来说，尽管每艘航母都很重要，但失去一艘只意味着等待几周时间就能得到已经开工建造的替代品。这种差异比任何一场战役、任何一位海军将领的才华或者战术创新更深远地影响了战争的结果。The Pacific War was won by industrial might rather than bravery, sacrifice, tactical genius, or warrior ethos. Instead, it was about manufacturing prowess, welding equipment, and assembly lines. This principle is still crucial for those studying warfare, strategy, or global competition today. The outcome of wars is often determined in factories long before the battles are fought on the ground. Vice Admiral Ozawa recognized this reality while standing on Taiha's Bridge in March 1944. He was aware that Japan had already lost due to the disparity in industrial capabilities. However, recognizing a problem and addressing it are two different challenges. Japan faced insurmountable constraints. They could not build additional shipyards because of shortages in steel, machine tools, workers, and logistical support. Similarly, training more pilots was impossible without sufficient fuel, instructors, or time. Furthermore, increasing steel production was out of the question due to a lack of coal, iron ore, and transportation capacity. In contrast, American industry continued to expand exponentially. By 1945, U.S. shipyards were launching Essex-class carriers that were not immediately needed for combat operations. Some of these ships were even completed after the war had ended without ever firing a shot in battle, yet they existed as a testament to America's industrial might. A total of 32 Essex-class carriers were ordered and 24 were ultimately completed. When the conflict concluded, 8 vessels were scrapped. Japan failed to construct the 14 UNRU-class carriers they had initially intended. Only 3 were ever completed. 6 additional carriers were in various stages of construction when hostilities ceased, while 5 never progressed beyond the planning stage. The difference between American and Japanese naval production capabilities was not merely significant. It was overwhelming. The Pacific War's outcome was largely determined by shipyard productivity rather than combat engagements. While battles dictated the timing of the war's end, it was the capacity of industrial facilities that ultimately decided which nation would emerge victorious. American shipyards, with their advanced prefabrication methods, innovative welding techniques, and standardized designs, combined with an army of inexperienced but highly motivated workers, overwhelmed Japan's naval construction efforts through sheer volume. Japan managed to build 6 carriers during 3 years of war, whereas the United States produced 17 Essex-class fleet carriers. The Americans also ceased counting after constructing over 100 escort carriers, still maintaining sufficient capacity for building thousands of merchant ships, landing craft, and liberty ships. This disparity in industrial output played a more decisive role than any individual battle, strategic maneuver, or tactical innovation. If you found this narrative engaging, please consider liking the video to help us share additional overlooked stories from World War II. Subscribing ensures you stay informed about these historically significant narratives that deserve recognition and remembrance. We'd be delighted to hear from you. Feel free to share in the comment section which part of the world you're joining us from. Our community is truly global, connecting passionate individuals across different continents. Whether you're a seasoned veteran or an avid history enthusiast, you are an integral part of this unique community. Thanks for tuning in and helping keep these stories alive.